Okay, so I'm going to try, and thanks very much to Ellis again for the lovely introduction and invitation to talk for about 50 minutes about how food can save the world in the light of COVID-19. And I begin with, really, for me, the most evocative and incomplete image of what I'm really talking about. This is, as I'm sure many of you know, the wonderful allegory of the effects of good government, Ambrogio Lorenzetti's famous fresco painted in the 14th century, which sits on one side of the town hall in Siena. And basically this image is, it's a utopian vision, you could say, but it's asking the question, what is a good life? And that question is one which, as you can see, they interpret as something to do with a relationship between the city on the one hand and the countryside on the other. And I'm just going to slightly fiddle with my screenshot because I can only see Ellis staring out, which is quite off-putting. Anyway, no, I can't see anything, which is fine. So what you're looking at here is, as I say, a profound relationship that's one that the modern world tends to obscure. Back in the 14th century in Italy, it was very obvious that the city and the countryside had this profound symbiotic relationship. And I think the fact that the fresco is called the allegory, the effects of good government, tells you everything you need to know. It's also very interesting to me that when I went to see this fresco for the first time, when I was an architecture student, I looked at it, stared at it, you know, in wonder and awe for about 30 minutes, but without realizing that it was all about food. And now that seems rather extraordinary to me, but I think it is a symptom of the fact that we don't really see food because food is everywhere in our lives and it shapes our lives, that it's often too big to see. But if you look in detail at this image, you can see that the red wall is not really a wall, it's more of a membrane, and passing through it is trade and commerce, huntsmen leaving the city to go and maybe shoot a boar, animals with corn on their backs coming into the city, a flock of sheep inside the city, and so on. So it's all about, as I say, this fundamental symbiosis between city and country that is the fundamental of civilization and therefore of a good life. Today, of course, we can't see the landscapes that feed us. Very often they're thousands of miles away on the other side of the world. We're physically and mentally distanced from the productive countryside, without which actually urban life would be impossible. And I call this the urban paradox. And I call it this because, in a sense, we think of ourselves, we talk of ourselves as urban animals. We think of ourselves as living in cities. But if you think about it in a more profound way, because our food comes from a place we call the countryside, we actually dwell elsewhere. And the paradox is that the more we gather together in cities in order to be together, which we love, and that's one of the great, I guess, cruelties, but also revelations of COVID-19 is really how profoundly social we are, then the further and further away we get from the sources of our sustenance. And it's a paradox because there's no ideal solution to this. Mind you, I mean, we, you know, in everyday life in the city, you would have thought that we'd solved the food problem. We're very used to going to supermarkets and finding this extraordinary cornucopia of produce at our door, which is partly why, of course, COVID-19 has come as such a shock. The sight of empty supermarket shelves for many people was just profoundly disturbing. You know, this illusion that we'd really solved the food problem just got swept away overnight. And I think even though the supermarkets have recovered and, you know, they're restocking the shelves and everything now, just the inherent fragility of the system really became visible to people for the first time. And not just that, but the fact that when the chips are down, if you like, food is what really matters. And that's not an accident, because food has been fundamental to our evolution as a species. Like all species, the question of how to eat is our most present, driving, everyday question. And we evolved through trying to sort of come up with better and better ways of feeding ourselves. So to begin with, the discovery of how to control fire was absolutely fundamental. This is a very long story, so I'll be very, very brief, but it allowed us to start cooking our food. And then the idea that some people, aka women, would stay in camp, and other people, aka men, would go and hunt. And that became the first human social contract. So I often say that you hunt, I cook is really both the first social contract, but also the shared meal that results from these two activities of foraging and hunting when the tribe comes together in the evening is the oldest human economy. And I think it remains the case, and I would certainly argue this, and do argue it in my book, Sitopia, that Alice kindly mentioned just now, that a good society is one in which everybody eats well. And I think as well in the light of COVID-19, that in a sense has become even clearer. Of course, what it means to eat well is a big conversation. But certainly how we eat, how we solve this problem of how to feed ourselves is fundamental to the way we live and the way we've shaped habitats through history. So for most of human history, as I don't have to tell you, we didn't live in cities. We lived in, I often say, in the larder. We lived in a productive landscape that we sort of moved around and kind of plucked fruit off trees, sometimes more faithfully than others, and basically made our home in a landscape that could feed us. But sometime, you know, actually very interestingly, coinciding with the most recent major global climate crisis called the end of the last ice age, we started to experiment, or our ancestors started to experiment with a different way of feeding themselves, i.e. farming. And again, long story that I'm sketching out very rapidly, but in essence, as these sort of very rich forests that were in fact the real life Garden of Eden began to recede northwards, there was an explosion of population as the world heated up and a shortage of food, and people began to experiment with the very difficult and not very rewarding business of farming. So lifespans shrank, people's teeth fell out because they were malnourished and so on. But nevertheless, one of the things that farming allowed us to do was to start living in static populations like the little triangles along the Mediterranean Sea, which were early, partly agrarian settlements. And then finally to build a series of complex enough settlements that archaeologists generally agree they deserve to be called cities, down at the head of the Persian Gulf where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers met. So what we learn from this evolution is that agriculture and urbanity co-evolved, and basically you can't have cities without farming. You can have farming without cities, but in essence, the two have co-evolved through history. So it's quite interesting then to look at what those early cities were like, and here's one of them, the city of I call it City 1.0 because it's really, you know, it does represent the first blueprint that we have for urbanity. In essence, what you have, if you look at this map, is a sort of a dense blob of urbanity in the middle. It's very small, it's about 500 meters across only. The sort of texture would have been very tight, so that bit of residential area in there would have been what the whole of that was like, so very little open space. It's obviously on a river, the Euphrates in this case. It's surrounded by farmland, and it's dominated in the middle by this large temple complex. And the complex, the temple not only organized the most important event of the year, which was the gathering in of the harvest, and offered it up to the gods in the famous ziggurat, but then gathered it in the city granary, baked it in the city bakeries, and then fed the people during the course of the year. So if you were going to say how did the world's first cities feed themselves, in modern terminology, you would say they were city-states. So that's a city surrounded by countryside, and they had a large centralized, what we would now call food distribution hub. And that was a very successful model, and it was repeated all over the world. And in fact, it sort of brings up a very interesting phenomenon, or at least dilemma, which Aristotle talked about. So Athens, Aristotle's home, was also a city-state. The polis was a city-state. So it's very much about the city and the countryside having equal value, and both Plato and Aristotle wrote about this extensively. But I love to use Aristotle's term political animals, because it's a very useful term, because what it tells us about, if you like, is the dilemma that we face as humans in terms of how we should live, because it talks about our inherent duality. So we're political on the one hand, which means we like to gather together, which is why we build cities. And on the other hand, we're animals, which means our sustenance comes from the natural world. So if you like, the fact that we're political animals is the basis of the urban paradox. Now, both Plato and Aristotle reckoned that the way to sort of deal with this, the ideal way, was what they called oikonomia, which is, you might sort of tell from the sound of it, is the basis of our word economics. And oikonomia was very straightforward. What it basically meant is that the ideal for the city was that every citizen would have a house in the city and a farm in the countryside, and the farm would feed the house, so the household was self-sufficient. So oikonomia comes from oikos, which means house, and nomos, which means management. So it's basically household management. And then if every citizen had that arrangement, then the city itself or the state would be self-sufficient. And for both Aristotle and Plato, this was ideal because it meant that the city could be politically independent. But it also meant that you should limit the size that the city grew to, because if it grew too big, then this kind of relationship where there was a direct relation between the house and the farm outside would be lost. So as Aristotle said, when you have a city, a state that's big enough that it can take care of all its own needs within itself, then that is the ideal size for the state. Now, most cities in the ancient world, as I said, followed this model, but not all. There was one famous city that bucked the trend, and of course that was Rome. And as you probably can see from this model, and probably already know anyway, Rome didn't follow this pattern at all. In fact, it had about 1 million citizens, it's estimated, by the 1st century AD. So it wouldn't have been possible for it to follow this model. And indeed, the German sociologist Werner Sombart called it the first consumer city, because what Rome did instead was it extended its tendrils out into the world further and further, and it extracted food in the form of taxes from all over the Mediterranean. The most important food was grain, because grain was a low value food, but it could be easily transported and stored. So that was really the basic food of all cities. And as you can see from this map, it sequentially conquered Sicily, Sardinia, Carthage in the north of Africa, and then very, very famously Egypt, which became Rome's breadbasket. And as you can also see from this map, basically it's all about access to the sea. So in the ancient world, it was about 50 times cheaper to transport food over the sea than over land. Which is why it was actually easier for Rome to get its grain from, shall we say, 20 miles outside the city and transport it by land. It was easier to just get it by ship from North Africa, because it was so much easier to transport. So if we look at the problem of feeding a city through history, we see two things. One is the difficulty of growing enough food, and grain was fundamental and remains fundamental. And secondly, the problem of transport. And you can also see that basically it would have been very difficult for another city the size of Rome to be anywhere in the Mediterranean region, because there simply wouldn't have been enough food to go round. So this idea that cities can modify the landscape a long way away from themselves, their immediate hinterland, was already evident in the ancient world. Now, the first person who analysed this phenomenon was Johann von Thünen. Some of you might remember him from first year architecture lectures, possibly. All a bit dry and boring, I found. But it's much more interesting if you apply it to a real city, which we'll do in a minute. But anyway, what von Thünen said was that if there was a city placed in a flat, fertile, undifferentiated plain, inhabited only by logical profit-seeking farmers, there would be a natural logic to the way that its hinterland would develop. So in the immediate outskirts of the city, you would have market gardening, because that's basically where fruit and vegetables could grow, which were luxury food, so the farmers could afford the high rent near the city, but they were also difficult to transport very far, so it made sense to grow them near the city. There was then a band of maybe 20 or 30 miles of grain production alongside other things such as the production of firewood for fuel. But there was a natural limit to how far away the grain could be produced, because basically it was low in value in relation to its bulk. So beyond about 30 miles, it became uneconomic to bring it into the city. So that basically limited the size to which the city could grow. And then on the very outskirts, there was the production of livestock, because of course the animals could walk into market, so they provided their own transport. And the only concession that Fontunen made to geography was to say that if the city was on a navigable river, then all of those bands could stretch a lot further away from the city, because you could just take the food to the river and then bring it into the city, and that was much easier to do. So as I say, it's all quite abstract and dry. It gets much more interesting when you look at real cities. And in a live event, this is usually when I present a quiz to my audience, but I can't do that today, sadly. Or maybe I could if I could.
You can.
Okay, a quiz, therefore. Here are two pictures. One on the left is London, one on the right is Paris, as you can see, similar dates, and they're the main food ports of both of those cities. So my question to you is, what do you immediately notice as a major difference between these two images?
Answers in the chat box.
Answers in the chat box.
Sales are coming up. People.
I'll take sales. I'm going to take sales. That's perfect. Perfect answer. Yeah. The thing is that on the left, you've got, and I'm going to stop looking at myself again. It's very distracting. I'll look at, no, I won't look at Alice. Maybe I will. Basically, London was on a navigable river, aka the Thames. So those are ocean-going vessels coming into the city. So long and short, London never struggled to feed itself. On the right, those are river barges, because the Seine was not navigable. So Paris, in short, did struggle to feed itself. And in fact, if we look at, oh, I see, I can't do that if I do that. Sorry, technical. Okay, I'll do that instead. If we look at, therefore, the way that both London and Paris fed itself, you see a very fascinating difference. On the left, you can see that London was part of the Hanseatic League. It was trading all over Europe, North Europe, the Baltic, which is where most of Europe got its grain from, into the Mediterranean and so on. So actually, the kind of trading routes that was existing during Rome's time are still all there, and London is hooked up. On the other hand, on the right-hand side, you can see that Paris is landlocked. And so instead of being able to just bring the food in from wherever, as Rome and London did, it had to impose its political will on the landscape via a series of what were called provisioning rings. So this is literally the city marching out into the countryside with muskets and saying, give us your grain. And if you think that roughly one in every 3 harvests used to fail in medieval times and in early modern Europe, then you can see what a popular policy that probably was. Now, in order to make this huge kind of thing work, Paris had an enormous grain police involving thousands of officials who did the king's bidding. It was very hierarchical. The king himself, you can see Louis XVI on the right-hand side, he was known as the baker of last resort. He was actually responsible for feeding people. If we look at the wonderful Turgot plan of Paris, you can see, so the grain port I showed you earlier on, the Porte aux Blés, was there. It's right by the Hôtel de Ville, so it's right by the town hall. So there's political oversight of the trade. And Les Halles, the main market, is right by the Louvre. And it was centralized. There was just one big market in the middle of Paris. So the idea was that, to control food and concentrate it all in one place. Now, what's interesting is that around about the sort of 1750s, Adam Smith went to visit Paris, and he got talking to the so-called physiocrats, who were the leading economists of their day, and François Quesnay was the sort of leader of this. And the physiocrats were obsessed with trying to feed Paris better because it always struggled to feed itself, and it was always teetering on the edge of running out of food. And the physiocrats were trying to free up trade But on the other hand, they were also obsessed with farming, and the whole economy in France was very agricultural, and they were obsessed with sort of keeping trade within France. So if you like, on the one hand, it's trying to ease up the relationship between the city and the country, but on the other hand, it's very fixed, it's very protectionist in terms of keeping all the food in France, basically. And Adam Smith found this very strange. And he wrote that the great commerce of every civilized society is that carried on between the inhabitants of the town and those of the country. So he's basically saying it's not just about the farmers, it's actually about the relationship between the city and the countryside. And he went on to say that the further away the city could trade, the better off it became, the more wealthy it became, even those locally might be in great poverty as a result. So he was really formulating the ideas that would then, he would go on to make famous in The Wealth of Nations, which came out a few years later, and of course form the basis of our free trade attitudes today. Indeed, I often say that, you know, the sort of the difference in geography between Paris and London explains Brexit. You know, that thing that kind of we used to talk about all the time, now we hardly mention. I mean, of course, nothing explains Brexit, but it's very, very interesting that this free trade attitude took root in Britain, which had very easy access to maritime trade. And then on the other hand, you see the consequences of the king having been held responsible for feeding Parisians. So this is what happens to Louis XVI. I'm going to have to speed up because I just looked at the clock and it was a bit scary. Anyway, this is a cartoon of the time called Fat Birds Fly Slowly, when, of course, there were a series of failed harvests in Paris, and the people rioted and they blamed the king for not feeding them. And he was accused of having been too greedy to even save his own skin, because as he was fleeing the city, he stopped to have a meal, and that's when he was arrested by the police. So, I mean, if you ever want a kind of a mini tutorial in why politicians hate having anything to do with food, look no further than Paris, in essence. So London, very different story. And as I say, I'm going to have to speed up radically because I seem to have just told you too much on the early slides. But if we look at the way London fed itself, it's very different. So you can see, for example, top left, all those market gardens that Fontunen talked about. But then you can see that's the city of London, which is doing all the trading. That's the view you saw earlier. And here is Westminster, way off, kind of out of the picture, basically. Nothing to do with the feeding of the city. And in fact, coming with a begging bowl and asking for money, in essence. So the centralisation that took place in Paris never occurred in London. In fact, all the markets are spread over different places. Billingsgate and Queenhithe are the two main river markets. Most of the corn is coming in. It's trying to flow up to Cornhill, where it was traded. Bread Street, you can tell by the name, is where it was traded up on the way. Fish, which is the blue map. Obviously, Billingsgate remained London's main fish market until the 1980s. So food paths often stay in one place for many centuries because it's very difficult to disrupt food. And then, you know, Friday Street, Fish Street. Friday Street is where you went to buy your fish on a Friday when you couldn't eat meat, so the eating of meat was forbidden. So again, the names of the streets are telling you that food is flowing through the city. Smithfield was a smooth field outside Newgate, and that's where all the animals that were coming down, again, if you think of Fontunen, they were coming down from Scotland and in from Wales, the unimproved pastures, as Adam Smith called them, providing their own transport, getting fattened up in the city outskirts and then being traded in the city. And if we look at that market, I mean, some of you may have seen that amazing documentary, Welcome to Lagos, where they show the livestock market there. Well, it would have been very similar. There were up to 10,000 animals in the city at one time, 184 unregulated slaughterhouses around the market and so on. So basically, if you lived in the pre-industrial city, it was very difficult to sort of not know where your food came from because it was kind of moving and buying outside your window. Anyway, I'm romping through this to try not to run out of time. The railways come and everything changes, to allow myself a cliche, overnight. Because of course, I call this goodbye geography because, you know, at a stroke, the geographical constraints that had hitherto determined where cities could be built are basically blown out of the water, because of the first time it's possible to transport food very rapidly over long distances. And three key things change at this point. The first is basically that cities are no longer constrained by geography, so they can grow any size they like in any place in more or less any shape. Secondly, politicians no longer take control of food, and basically I've just shown you why they were very keen not to be responsible for feeding people. And last but not least, food becomes invisible. So instead of cows mooing sort of in the middle of the city, they're slaughtered outside the city and they come in as dead meat. And these are three profound changes that have major implications for the way we live today. So here's just a graphic representation of London effectively exploding after the coming of the railways. The rural transformation is just as dramatic. So what happens in the American Great West when the railways come is that what had been a grassland being sort of grazed by, it's estimated something like 60 million bison. The bison are sort of basically shot with machine guns from the top of the trains. Their skulls are just piled up. I mean, nobody did anything with the meat or not much with the skins either. They were just got rid of. So were the Native Americans who happened to be living with them. And then you had basically the world's first enormous grain glut, essentially, sort of monocultural grain production as far as the eye could see. And my next quiz, I'm going to have another quiz then, since you seem to like quizzes. So what do you do when you've got more grain than you can eat?
Answers in the chat box. Store it, feed it to animals.
Feed it to animals, very good. Take a house point. Yes, you feed it to animals. So we have the invention of cheap meat. So this is basically the Chicago stockyards, up to 18 million animals kept in pens, fed on grain brought in by train from the prairies. And this is really the beginning of the commodification of food. Fascinating, long story, but in essence, the invention of cheap food. So cheap food is what we sort of build our lives around. We don't pay enough for food, or we don't pay its true cost, in essence. But what the meat packers did, because Chicago was the sort of the place where all of the animals being driven up from Texas were sort of gathered and then fed, and they had to get them to the East Coast, which is where the major markets were. And they basically invented the chill chain, what we would now call the chill chain. So Gustavus Swift, who was one of the big 3 meat packers in Chicago, worked out that if you hung blocks of ice at either end of the railway carriage and hung your dressed beef in between, then basically the air passing through it would keep the beef fresh and it could reach the East Coast in an edible condition. And then he built these little kind of display cases in the city, and basically undersold. I mean, just sold the meat super cheaply until people sort of gave up buying their meat from the local butcher and started to trust this rather sort of bizarre, shipped in from somewhere else, kind of unseen meat. And so that was the beginning of really the mastery of food logistics being at the center of the food system. Of course, bad stuff started happening. So basically, if you replace grassland with monocultural grain production, you destabilize the ecosystem. And famously, in the 1930s, there were a series of very dry years, and then basically the topsoil of the whole of the American Midwest blew away. And lots of people were millions of people were displaced and fled west and never came back. So it was really the beginning of the understanding that the industrial model of feeding us, which was apparently so successful and so on, had its downsides. And it's the beginning of a battle that we're still really seeing raging today between, on the one hand, Justus Liebig, who is this brilliant German chemist who was the first to really analyze that plants needed N, P, and K, so nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus. So I said that really weirdly: nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, NPK, and other brilliant German scientists. I mean, it's no accident the Germans are better at COVID-19 than us as well, by the way. I mean, they're just good at this stuff. But anyway, Messrs. Haber and Bosch, who another quiz. Does anyone know what Messrs. Haber and Bosch actually did? And by the way, if I tell you that something like 40% of the global population is fed because of what Haber and Bosch did, I'll be very impressed if anyone knows this. Almost nobody ever does know this, unless I'm at a farming conference.
Fertilizers coming up.
Yeah, but I kind of put that there. So what about fertilizers?
Invented a seed dropper, ammonia production.
Yeah, ammonia production, very, very good. So basically, very good. I'm very impressed whoever that was. Basically, the fixing of atmospheric nitrogen. So essentially, I haven't got time to go into this. Anyway, basically, most of the nitrogen in the world is in the air and you need to get it in the ground, and they worked out how to do that industrially. So all unnitrogenous fertilizers are based on their process. So that's the kind of the industrial model, if you like. Very high yields, monocultures and so on, but also massive downsides like the Dust Bowl, like mass pest epidemics and so on, because of the lack of biodiversity. And so at that time, people like Albert Howard, and he was really key to what we understand as the modern organic movement, were saying, no, we can't go ahead like this. It's all about the living soil. It's all about the microbes in the soil. And that is where plant health and fertility come from. And basically, if you feed NPK to plants, it's like feeding salt, sugar, and fat to your kids. The plants just get sick, basically, because they don't forge the mycorrhizal connections in the soil that actually allow them to draw rich, sort of complex nutrients out of the soil. It's a partnership between the roots and soil fungi. Anyway, so that all was raging, and actually Albert Howard was getting some very powerful backers, including Yves Balfour, who set up the Soil Association in the UK. But then unfortunately this happened, the war happened, and as you can see, it's all about growing as much food as possible. And this is really when the sort of the pendulum swung very, very firmly towards industrial food production and so on. Hedgerows were stripped, horses were replaced by tractors, and farms had to get bigger to survive, all of that. Of course, after the war, this expansion of cities goes to a whole other level with cars, the sort of the development of suburbia in New York and other places in the United States. The good life then becomes about basically mobility. We no longer walk to a market in the middle of the city, but we drive out of the city to a mall like Southdale Centre, which was designed by an Austrian architect, Victor Gruen, the first refrigerated mall or air-conditioned mall in the world, where you wander around in eternal springtime inside. And if you're shopping, you sort of buy all of these denatured boxes of stuff masquerading as food, and you kind of come home and wonder what it all is and stick it in the fridge and half of it goes off. So it's really the beginning of this kind of super distancing from food and what it is. Other consequences, the evisceration of the city, the creation of food deserts, this is a map of New York showing areas in red where you have to walk more than 500 meters to get a source of fresh food. Because if you think back to that early map of that I showed you, basically the city is no longer feeding its people, the market is feeding people, so the food goes where the money is. Power in the food system, so some of you may know this diagram. Basically every brand that you know and see on a shelf, it isn't itself, it's owned by somebody else. And then we have food companies that have annual turnovers bigger than many national GDPs. And if you think that the control of food is power, which is what all those ancient city fathers knew and which we seem to have forgotten, that's a pretty dire place to be in. And then we see that actually cheap food doesn't exist. Actually, it's an oxymoron, and it's based on all of these externalities, such as lost or degraded farmland, climate change gases, of which about 30% related to food and farming, fresh water, of which 70% is involved in farming, a lot of it's non-renewable sources, 2 billion overweight, 1 billion without enough to eat, diet-related disease, which of course is a major factor in terms of our susceptibility to COVID-19 as well, because a lot of the underlying health issues that we have that make us susceptible are because we eat badly. Eutrophication, which is excess runoff of fertilizer from lakes, waste, so that's from a supermarket dumpster. We waste up to about 50% of the food that we produce in the West. A third of the grain harvest being fed to animals, so very inefficient use of food. 10 calories of energy going to produce every calorie of food we consume. And last but very much not least, the sixth mass extinction, which has happened on the back of this industrial food model that we followed. And this is normally my scariest slide that I have in a lecture. It's basically the fact that the whole world is turning into a hamburger because people can't resist the Western foods model because it's full of salt, sugar, and fat, and our brains go into sort of lockdown and we kind of can't get enough of it. And of course, all the power in food is to sell this sort of fast food globally. But in a way, you know, that for me, what's been really interesting, and this is where the sort of the COVID-19 thing starts to feed into my story, is that COVID-19 is actually sort of showing us many, many things that in a way, if you look at the world through food, are already evident. So the first is clearly that we've got a problem, that our relationship with nature is out of kilter, but also that we're in it together. So if you go back to the conversation between Adam Smith and Kesney, you know, basically free trade has taken over and we live in a very, very globalized world. But it also shows you a number of things that sort of get into the real nitty-gritty of our sort of dilemmas as political animals. So for example, this image on top left, some of you may have seen the mass exodus from Indian cities that resulted when there was a lockdown a few weeks ago. So something about 45 million Indians are villagers who have casual work in cities, and they actually literally live from day to day. So they were all displaced instantly and had to go home. If you look bottom left, that's food delivery guys in Bangkok waiting for deliveries while socially distancing. So that, if you like, is about wealth, because clearly the people who are ordering their food and paying someone to bring it to their houses can afford to do that. If you look top right, it's about the out of kilter relationship that we have with nature. And of course, COVID-19 is thought to have started in a wet market in China. And this is all to do with our encroachment on wilderness. And it's all to do with the lack of biodiversity in the food system, which makes us susceptible to zoonotic pandemics. And of course, there have been a whole series of them before this one. And there will be more if we don't change the way we eat and the way we farm. And bottom right, just the fact that, you know, we'd really, again, we thought we'd solved the food problem. And again, you know, immediately that we can't sort of import cheap labor from elsewhere in Europe, we suddenly think, we're not going to be able to pull our food out the ground. So basically, all of these things together show us that, you know, the system that we have is fragile, much more fragile than we realized. But of course, good stuff's coming out of COVID-19 as well. So we're seeing all of these heartwarming stories of neighborliness and people looking after each other, new food networks springing up very, very rapidly, which is really interesting because this is not new. So for example, in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina, the very same sort of thing happened. People began immediately starting up alternative food networks, which still exist to this day in many cases. People being stuck at home and thinking, oh gosh, what am I going to do all day? Oh, maybe I'll cook with the kids, you know, so a rediscovery of what it is to have time on your hands and actually to do stuff with it rather than just dashing around earning money the whole time. So we're seeing really the emergence of a sort of non-financial economy, which is really interesting. And of course, you know, an explosion of interest in growing your own food. And I think, you know, both my kind of Armageddon, the world is a hamburger slide, and COVID-19 on top of it, both really make us pause. And I think COVID-19 is an extraordinary opportunity to pause and say, where were we going anyway? And actually, what was the problem we were trying to solve? And I love this quote from Cedric Price, you know, technology is the answer, but what was the question? Of course, the thing is, the question is the same question. It's always been, what is a good life? How should we live together? And always based on, how should we eat? So if you look at Plato's Republic, you know, it's all about oikonomia, the same stuff that Aristotle was talking about. If you look at Thomas More's Utopia, it's about London getting too big and too greedy, and maybe we should go back to a series of semi-independent network city-states. If you look at Ebenezer Howard's Garden City model, it's really kind of Thomas More with railways. It's also about incremental land reform. It's also about, you know, the ideal habitat for a political animal being 1 foot in the city and 1 foot in the countryside, which, if you think about it, is what rich people have always had. They always have a place in the country. I mean, I don't know about you, but my street in London is deserted at the moment because everyone's ignored government advice and they've gone to their second homes. So there's nobody here. That's obviously tells you I live in quite a posh part of London. It's actually not that posh, but anyway, it's very interesting to me. They've all left anyhow. But of course, utopia doesn't exist. And this is really where I guess my proposal for Sitopia comes in. Utopia is a good place, but it is no place. So it's ideal and therefore can never exist. But actually what I've discovered in my research of Sitopia, and also just my research of the way we live in general, and the big questions that we face, is that it always comes back to food. And this is why I invented this word Sitopia, which means food place, from the Greek sitos for food and topos for place. The point is that we already live in Sitopia. We just live in a really bad Sitopia because we don't value food, because we think it should be cheap, but it can't be cheap. And I often say, if you think that food is, you know, living things that we kill so that we can live, that tells you immediately that if you cheapen food, you cheapen life. So that's the proposal, is that we build a better Sitopia through food. That is how we build our lives, rebuild our lives after COVID-19, through food. How do we do that? Well, we just look at what we eat. So this is this brilliant book. I'm going to try and finish in the next 5 minutes, by the way, but I'm just going to go faster and faster and faster. Anyway, you think this is fast, it's nothing. You look at what we eat, and from that you can extrapolate a huge amount. So you can basically extrapolate what kind of landscapes are we producing. We're producing the kind of landscape where you want to go on holiday, with cows actually eating grass, which, by the way, we can't eat. So that's a beautiful synergy. Whereas on the right-hand side, you see a CAFO, concentrated animal feeding operation, with 160,000 cows wandering around in their own poo. Not a good idea. Being pumped full of antibiotics, which we're probably going to need because, as I say, zoonotic pandemics are kind of here to stay. Middle line, you know, do we go into the middle of the city and actually use food to animate space? And I find it, again, fascinating that C19, I mean, guess what you're allowed out of your house to do to get food? Surprise, surprise. Well, actually, that's always been the case, you know. So that's an opportunity to socialise. Or do we stay indoors and order it online, basically? And of course, now we have the magic carpet of Deliveroo and so on. Do we slow down? Do we take time to enjoy food together, which is basically how we evolved as a species? And by the way, all the research says is what makes us happy. Again, big discovery of COVID. We like spending time with our loved ones. We like being at home. We like sharing food. We like tactile contact. Or are we too busy to eat? So in a pre-COVID shot, you know, 20% of American meals until a month ago were being eaten in a car, which just gives you some sense of the crazy spin-a-thon we were living until very recently. Right, this is just explaining that the true value of food becomes very, very clear when you don't have enough. Somebody just had a cat jumping off their screen, that's quite interesting. So London after the war, or during the war, Havana after the fall of the Soviet Union, Detroit after the motor cars left, all immediately, big thing, went back to growing food. The true value of food is the food that you need to survive. And that tells you also that because food comes from nature, we have to start working with nature and not against it. So there's lots of numbers to do with this, which I've gone into in vast detail and don't have time for now, but we can feed ourselves roughly 80% organically globally if we halve the amount of meat and dairy we eat and halve the amount of food we waste, which is doable if there's the political will. It requires land reform. It requires more people farming, not less, but that's fine because we're going to be paying more for food in my Sitopian model. My proposal is basically we internalize the true cost of food, and many things change from this. It requires a different approach to countryside. I'm very interested, for example, in a land value tax, which tends to neutralize the value of land. The idea of sovereignty, so basically you have a patch of land and you can choose to feed yourself if you want, but also bringing sort of infrastructure into the countryside, which is what Kropotkin, the anarchist who inspired Ebenezer Howard, was talking about. And of course, regenerative farming. Sitopian economics, which is the idea, again, that we base our economy on food. So slow money are already doing this. The transition movements talked a lot about this. It's about sort of restabilizing the economy in the region. And again, I think this is a conversation, again, goes back to London versus Paris. We're going to be having over the next few weeks and months over, you know, what is resilience in the light of a sort of, in the light of a global world. and clearly it's to do with biodiversity, but it's also clearly to do with a greater degree of local regional resilience. So the ideas of oikonomia become very interesting again. This is the basis of new economics. Obviously, it's not going to be the same everywhere, and that's a very important takeout from Kate Raworth's donut economics model. The West needs to consume less, other places need to consume more, and so on. It's a balancing act. We have to democratize our food system because, as I say, control of food is power. The food system at the moment looks like the tree on the left. So what we need to do is join the branches to the roots, so join the farmers to the consumers in ways that aren't just an enormous mega corporation. This brings in Carlo Petrini's idea of co-producing. Carlo Petrini was the co-founder of Slow Food. Ideas like community-supported agriculture, top left, which is basically city dwellers paying farmers to feed them in advance, so you're taking on some of the risk and maybe working on the farm yourself, so you get that city-country balance. Food co-ops like top right, Food Slope, Park Slope Food Co-op, which has been existing for 40 or 50 years now, has about 200,000 members. They work, in the shop, but they also have long-term contracts with local farmers. Local in America means 100 miles away or less. Organic box schemes. Of course, we're seeing a massive resurgence of this as the food supply is disrupted by COVID-19 and people realizing they need to support farmers who used to supply the restaurants directly, guerrilla gardening and many, many other ideas. But the idea is that we become active in the food system because that is how we rebuild a democracy. It's always around food. Of course, we need global governance models that are going to enhance and allow this. I find it very interesting. I mean, if you look at a lot of the research done by people like Eleanor Ostrom into successful the use of the commons, the management of the commons, it's polycentric and it's nested. So you have a lot of local agency, but then you have orders of, appeal courts, as it were, above it. So it's the idea that you invest more agency at a local and regional level. On the right-hand side, you can address all of the UN's development goals through food. It's about balance between the city and the country. And I often say that we're living now in a neo-geographical age. So basically, I mean, interestingly, Patrick Geddes talked about a neo-technic age when he foresaw that technology was going to allow us to live kind of anywhere and any place. And ironically, it's kind of turned on its head. But his ideas, I think, are extremely relevant still. So he was talking about evolving cities so that you still maintained, I mean, for me, I call it maximizing the urban-rural interface, but basically preserving ribbons of countryside as cities grow. That's for growing cities. This could be relevant to the global south. For the global north, top right, we have ideas like Vernon Viljoen's sea pools or continuous productive urban landscapes, which is the idea of joining up available pockets in the city and making them productive to create ribbons out into the countryside. The idea of interrogating the region, the food shed of a city, bottom left, like Urban Design Labs study, what could, for example, New York's local region produce that the city could consume? And it's a lot more than it consumes at the moment, of course. And projects like Almera Osterwald by MBRDV, where they're trying to incorporate food growing in the development of the city. Food planning's probably been around for about 20 years. I think it's extremely relevant. Again, a lot of the interesting models are quite small scale. They're about growing on roofs. They're about farmers markets, about patchwork farms. So the idea that even though you can't feed a city from within itself, because that's the urban paradox, actually growing food in the city is very important because it makes it visible again, one of the big things. It allows us to re-engage with nature, but also it reproduces, if you remember, the von Thunen inner ring of fruit and veg. And I think that's really where vertical farms fit in the picture, by the way, if you're interested in those. Embedding it in governance, making space for food, infrastructure like local abattoirs, very important. I do think we need meat in the system as well, by the way, but just not very much. That's a long conversation as well. But of course, if you value food, because food, as again we are discovering through COVID-19, is the one thing that we have to consume every day. And therefore, it's such an amazing opportunity to not have, as it were, cheese that looks like a breeze block, as in on the left, which is what British cheese looked like in the 1970s. I remember it well. But if you value it, and if you allow people to develop craft and locality and work with nature, then you get this extraordinary flowering of culture on the right-hand side that we in fact have in this country now. So to summarize, everything's changed and nothing's changed. You know, the way we evolved as humans, that shared meal, which was the first ever human economy, remains the best ever human economy. If everybody eats well together, and if we start to share through food rather than share through money, because we're really good at sharing through food and we're really bad at sharing through money, and you know, nobody at that table is just going to grab it all for themselves, but that's what people in banks do all the time. That is my metaphor for the way we need to go globally. And last but not least, it's about using food as a lens, because food is the great connector, it's the great shaper, it shapes our lives in ways that we do and don't see. But it's also something that's doing it actively every day. It's a flow through our lives that if we value it, we can basically build a better Sitopia. And a really good Sitopia, by the way, is pretty close to utopia. And if you want to know any more, those are my 2 tomes. It took about 10 years each to write, so I don't know whether there's going to be another one. Anyway, thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry that was such a romp, but anyway, that's it from me. And please hit me with your questions. Thanks a lot.
It was completely epic. It was an absolutely sensational talk. Now, I've got a few questions coming up, and I hope there's maybe some more, but I'm going to hand over first to Amy Aquilina. If I can unmute you, Amy. Amy, you've got the mic.
Oh, yeah, so I'm an architecture student in Glasgow, and I've been doing a bit of research. I've read Hungry City, and I was just thinking, how do architects and planners have the power to change the unsustainable relationship between cities and food on a larger scale? Because I understand that we should all be working on it on an individual scale, but realistically, not everyone in the city is going to grow their own food or stop.
Yeah. Thanks a lot for that question. Do I do stop share, the red thing, by the way, now?
Yeah, let's see your face. Do the stop sharing.
Oh, you can't see my face. Okay, can you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So yeah. Basically, I romped through this very, very quickly, but what I've come up with is I talk about maximizing the urban-rural interface. So, I started coughing now. So basically, as I say, the ideal habitat for a political animal is to have 1 foot in the country and 1 foot in the city. Now, we're not all rich enough to have 2 different houses, like Aristotle's ideal citizens. So we need to design the world so that we can have it close by at different scales. So if you like, the ideal is for the city and its region to have close, you know, networked contact. But the ideal is also, for example, for houses to have gardens or balconies or shared growing spaces or something, so that even at the scale of an individual dwelling, you have the potential for nature and maybe to grow food if you want. As you rightly say, not everybody wants to grow food, that's totally fine. But a surprising number of people do want to. And so for me, I mean, examples where, I mean, Le Corbusier even sort of incorporated this in a lot of housing designs. You know, Bedzed's another example. I mean, there are many sort of housing projects where some sort of community growing is included, and they do bring people together, and people, you know, it really does sort of enhance the kind of the degree to which there's neighborliness, there's contact, because food brings people together. So it can also be at the scale of literally a generous window box outside your, you know, on the windowsill. So I often say it's like a fractal. You know, because at any scale, it's still about, I mean, it's quite a permacultural idea, actually. It's about maximizing that interface. But as designers, I think it's just something always to have in mind, because this thing is never not an issue. You know, so I look at plans now and I kind of say, okay, where's the food coming from? You know, who's feeding these people? And it's a great question to ask, because it always tells you what's going to work and what's not going to work.
Claire Bond, you're next.
Hi, Carolyn. I just wanted to ask you a bit more about where you think sort of meat consumption sits within the context of Sitopia.
Yeah.
As sort of society now kind of seems to be telling us that if we're not 100% plant-based, then we're not saving the planet.
Yeah. Really, really important question. And I'm actually going to show you a book, because this is an absolutely brilliant book, I think. It's okay. Simon Fairley's Meat, A Benign Extravagance. And I actually use his research quite extensively in my book. what he's got this fantastic concept. He calls it default livestock. So I think, you know, in all the research that I did, what became very clear to me is we have to stop farming chemically and monoculturally, i.e. industrially. So industrial livestock production is just bad on every possible level. It just has to stop. It just has to stop. This means there is no such thing as cheap meat, but there can't be anyway, as I explain. You know, the last thing, I mean, cheap carrots are bad enough, but you know, cheap chickens are just, you know, they're basically ethically unacceptable. So for where I happen to sit in all of this is that we should go back to farming with nature, which means farming organically to the greatest extent possible. And that means you need animals in the system, but you know, not much. So basically they're part of the kind of the recycling of nutrients. So as we know, cows can eat grass, and then we can eat the cow. I'm personally fine with that. Of course, there's a big methane issue, but we can probably do a little bit about that. But anyway, there's going to be far fewer cows because we're only going to grow them, for example, you know, where you can't really do anything else, and in small quantities. But also they can eat crop residues, you know, and they can distribute, they can keep marginal lands stable. So for example, the trouble with the meat thing is it's such a huge issue. Anyway, so the Midwest shows you that actually that was a stable environment when it was grazed by bison, actually, but unstable when it goes to monocultural grain production. Yeah. So I think the shorthand with meat is much less, it's much more, treat it as a luxury, and it's part of mixed organic systems, and then it makes sense. And there's a reason we co-evolve with farm animals, by the way, because they're a very, very good source of nutrition, but only when farmed in the right way. So Simon Fairley's, his idea, he calls it default livestock. So you raise livestock on the back of a plant-based food system, farming system, and only those animals that you can kind of raise for free on the back of it. So I really recommend his book. It's really interesting. And that's where I'm at.
Brilliant.
But you know,
that's great.
They have to have good lives and good deaths.
Yeah.
Any animal we eat has to have a good life and a good death.
Ruby, you've got the microphone.
Hi. Yeah, I was wondering how you think architecture could play a role to try to change the culture that we have around food production. I think at the moment, like as you were saying, we kind of export it to the global south to produce food, or migrant workers here, and how do we get people more excited about producing food on our balconies and growing it?
Yeah, I mean, I personally have started growing food on my roof here in Marylebone in central London, which astonishes me, but they love it. They go mad. I mean, plants kind of like heat, and they get a lot of that. So that's totally transformed the way I think about food. Now, not everybody's going to do that, but I mean, for me, the great value of having the growing of food in cities, and it can only really be fruit and veg. I mean, you're never going to feed a city from within itself, but is precisely that sort of reconnecting us with the wonder of a plant, you know, the wonder of soil. And, you know, I think, I mean, your question is how can architects kind of enhance this? I think it's absolutely always be on the lookout for making food visible. So whether it's, as you say, providing balconies in flats where people can grow stuff, whether it's making spaces, you know, for a food market once a week if you're doing an urban plan, you know, looking at, I mean, for example, like that Almera Ulsterwald project of MVRDV, actually looking if you're designing sort of housing, I hate the word housing, but anyway, a kind of an area where people are going to live, say, okay, well, you know, where are these people going to get their food? Where are they going to grow their food? You know, what are the opportunities for them to sort of, you know, I mean, progressively go from just having, you know, carnations on the windowsill to actually being semi-self-sufficient vegetables. And that is very much a design issue. And all the way out to the infrastructural question. So I'm very exercised when I see, for example, London Smithfield, which, you know, has survived for, you know, over 1,000 years in its position. It's now finally succumbed. Well, let's see if COVID-19 puts the boot in, but, you know, it's going to be developed and cease being a market. For me, the opportunity there was to have an urban food hub, you know, so actually a place where local and regional producers could come and, you know, sell their stuff, but, you know, scaled up from, well, I mean, basically what all wholesale markets have always been, essentially, so I think looking at the sort of the network that's joining the city to the region, it depends what, at every scale that you're operating at as a designer, always ask the question, how are the people inhabiting my building eating? Where are they getting their food from? What are the opportunities for them to actually engage in it directly, see it, touch it, smell it, live it, eat it?
Last question goes to Benjamin Brace.
Hello there. Hi, Carolyn.
Hi.
Thanks for the lecture. It was great. It was just a question on, in my experience, obviously one of the biggest blockers to kind of addressing our kind of dislocation with food, for example, incorporating edible landscapes within the public realm, is a lack of skills and desire within local authorities, kind of planning teams.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you had any insight into how the architectural professions, and full disclosure, I'm a landscape architect. How can we kind of tackle this issue?
Yeah, no, I mean, really, really important. So I mean, I don't know about you, but food didn't come up very much when I was being educated personally, and I think it's partly a kind of professional thing. So I think architects could and very much do sort of offer themselves out to kind of be part of the education of planners and designers and so on outside the profession. I think architects are embracing food a lot more than they used to. I mean, certainly vertical gardens has kind of taken off, grown very rapidly, but local authorities, I mean, the question is, who are these people? What is their route into what they do? And I absolutely agree. I mean, I think the win-win with food is that, there's always amazing benefits, financial, health, social, and so on. So as a designer going into the local authorities, I mean, let's assume that they haven't somehow met the thought of what food can do for them in their training, and there they are sitting there not very interested, is to, clearly offer them short courses or programs in how, food planning, which is a thing, but also to show them, what including, for example, food growing spaces in a housing development could do, because the stats are all there for, enormous benefits in terms of social interaction, better health, just more social cohesion in general. I mean, I absolutely hear the problem, and it's not just local authorities, by the way, it's the nation as a whole. I mean, we had forgotten what food was until very recently, and I'm personally hoping that COVID-19 is going to be a moment when we say we're never going to go back there, because now we get what food is and we rethink it. But yes, I mean, it's going to have to be an answer on many levels, unfortunately, as all of these questions always are.
Thank you, everybody, for the fantastic questions. We've got a couple more sessions this evening, including a reading from MFK Fisher.
Oh, yes.
9 o'clock,
yeah.
American food writer. So I'm sure kind of resonant with what Carolyn's been talking about. Next up, we at 7 o'clock, back on Zoom, we have Pier Paolo Tamburelli, fantastic architect or director at Baucu in Milan, and also founding co-editor of San Rocco, one of the really, I think, the defining kind of architecture magazine for me of the past decade. So he's going to be talking about architecture and politics. We're all going to do two things. We're going to go and order Carolyn's book online now, and then when the video of this is up on YouTube tomorrow, we're all going to share it with on social media, because it deserves an even bigger audience than it's got tonight. Carolyn, it was sensational. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for everyone who joined us.
Yeah, I'm going to unmute and then, so we can have some clapping, and then we will have a little more Andras Schiff doing Goldberg variations, which is Carolyn's choice for intro music. Unmuting all now.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
This woman who just spoke was awesome.
Thank you.
Like